Morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is. We left off last time with basically the background of the war, the different governments, different foreign policies, advantages north and south, troops, daily living, the enormous rate of casualties. And this is a direct segue to that because I'm starting with slide number 37 under Civil War, the war technologies. And one reason this war is incredibly dangerous is that there is, like every war, we find better ways to kill people, basically. So there's a lot of military innovation. There's a lot of new technology being used. As usual, the technology is ahead of the tactics and the morality because the Civil War is still a war where you line up across the field from the other guy and try and blast him before he blasts you. Sorry, I had to set my timer there. Okay. Up until this point, the average musket, which still a lot of soldiers have, particularly in the South, the range are from 30 to 50 yards. You're talking less than 200 feet. A rifle, including the new Springfield rifles that they're using in the Civil War, particularly by the Union, have a range of 300 yards, but they're slower to load. But the range is much, much greater. You are 900 or 1,000 feet. Revolvers came in at the end of the war, but they're just being developed, and they're mainly for officers and mainly in the Union. So the average enlisted man is still using a rifle. Still a single shot, still takes about a minute to reload. Okay, so one of the first things that come about, of course, is this is the first war to use a railroad as a weapon. Railroads are relatively new, less than 20 years old. Again, most of the rail lines, as we talked about before, were in the north. This turned out to be a huge advantage because the Union uses the railroad to move men, supplies, and even cavalry troops. So if you have a battle, let's say in eastern Pennsylvania, and they know, and now there's telegraph as well, they know pretty quickly that it looks like things are happening in southern Illinois, you can get 3,000 cavalry troops there overnight by train. To get there on foot would take weeks, a matter of weeks. So this is a war weapon in the Civil War. Slide number 38, 39 are also a new weapon. These are called the ironclads. This is a new form of battleship. If you look at it, you can see quite clearly what is the energy source here. It's a steamboat that has iron plates on the side, basically like a turtle. They just screwed in big sheets of iron. And I've seen part of these plates in Charleston at the museum, and the plates are about as thick as a thumb, about as thick as your thumb. But they were hugely useful because basically cannonball are going to bounce off of them, the cannon that they had at the time, and certainly rifle balls are going to bounce off of them. So they're pretty much unsinkable if you have them. Union had some. Confederates begin to build some. Towards the end of the war, they actually destroyed the ones that were not finished because they were worried they're going to fall in Union hands. But they did buy some from Britain. Remember, part of Britain's deal is she is selling supplies, guns, ammunition, boats to both sides in the Civil War, making money off of both ends. So there's these famous battles between ironclads. In battle, as far as I know, none of them were ever sunk. The battles were always a draw because they're pretty much impregnable. Slides number 40, 41 are another new innovation. This was the Hunley, and you can actually see it right off the docks. It is preserved in Charleston next to a museum. The Hunley is a prototype of a submarine. Clearly, it's a submarine. Not a very good one. It was 33 feet long. It was about 5 feet tall. The propellant, the power source here, were 8 men that were cranking like a bicycle crank, but hand cranks. So they're cranking as fast as they could go, and you had a guy in back who was steering. Its top speed was 4 miles an hour. It was Confederate. It was launched in Charleston, and it was a war weapon. It had a long steel pole on the front, on the bow of the ship, and at the end of the pole, they had explosives. So the goal was to go up next to an enemy ship and detach the explosives and blow up the enemy ship. Never got there. On its maiden voyage, something happened. We don't know. They didn't have the technology, and the thing sunk. And again, I wish we were in class because I have some great articles from archaeology and from Charleston that I could pass around to show you. But the thing sunk. All men were killed on it. 9 people were killed. They went back about 15 years ago. They located the Hunley. They raised it. They preserved it. It is in the museum now, and they had 9 bodies. Everything in the sub, of course, the bones were there, but nothing else. But the buttons on the uniform, the weapons, everything was perfectly intact. It had been preserved under the water for close to 200 years. They knew who these people were because they had military records. So they took the bones of the 9 men and gave them back to their families for burial, which to me is an incredibly spooky thing. But they actually did find the Hunley. Slide number 42 is another new innovation. This is a French invention, as we saw in the movie with John Adams. Adams and Jefferson are watching a trial hot air balloon. They hadn't developed the technology a whole lot over the years, so it's still something that can go up. They were used for surveillance, again, mainly by the Union, and they weren't really released. Even by 1860, they really didn't have the technology down, but they were used for surveillance. They would put them up on a rope, you'd have somebody look around, they'd bring you down. Because the minute you put up something that big on a rope, every cannon and every rifle on the enemy side for miles around is going to be trying to shoot it down. So you didn't have much time up there, but it's a great thing for surveillance because you can be higher than anything else. The next slide, 43 and 44, are something very interesting that were invented. It is a pontoon bridge. And these could be built anything up to 2,000 feet over a good-sized river. What is a pontoon bridge? It is a bunch of flat-topped boats, like rowboats, that they put little platforms on. You tie them together, and you can march your army across. As you see in the second slide, you can use them to transport cannon. You can get cavalry across them. Horses will not cross them unless you blindfold them, but if you blindfold them, you can lead a horse across because, of course, the boats move in the water. Huge advantage. If you look at that first slide, how long would it take to build a bridge over this river? Most southern rivers, and even in the north, had no bridges. You had ferries, maybe, or you swam. So if you're trying to get 10,000 men to the other side overnight, you built a pontoon bridge. They lined up the boats, they marched the troops across, then the boats were untied, they were put on wagons, and you could move them downstream, upstream, or to the next river as well. Huge transportation advantage in the war, again, mainly used by the Union. Slide number 45 is another better way to kill people, called a Gatling gun. This is an early machine gun, again, a French invention. Mr. Gatling of some kind invented it. This is an early model. Somebody had the brilliant idea of, in order to kill people faster, let's put a bunch of rifle barrels on a wheel and connect the triggers. This one has 6. Thank God they were not coming around until the end of the Civil War. Otherwise, casualties would have been much higher than 650,000. But they are slowly coming in. Shortly after the Civil War, they have Gatling guns that have 50 barrels that can shoot 50 shots in just a couple minutes without reloading. They were taken out on the Great Plains and used systematically against rebelling Great Plains Indian tribes. They'd set them up on a hill above a village and wipe out the entire village in a matter of minutes. The next couple of slides, there's 2 versions of that, are another technological innovation. These are new bullets. And you can see up until this point, a bullet was a round lead ball, like a marble. Okay, different calibers, but let's say a decent-sized marble. That's why if you see in the Patriot, right before the battle, Mel Gibson is melting down lead, and they're solid lead balls. Lead melts at a very low temperature. You could make bullets over an open fire without any problem. Civil War, they get a new innovation. Now we have bullet-shaped bullets that are pointed at one end and flat at the other and contain a little bit of gunpowder in the flat end with a cap on the end. So now this is a huge difference. With rifles, which have a spiral barrel inside, not just an iron tube, this is why the range was much greater. So that these pointed bullets in a rifled barrel would shoot 3 times the distance or more of just a lead ball in a musket. Direct result, of course, casualties rise enormously. The other problem with these bullets is that, unlike a lead ball, if you're shot by a lead ball, we saw that with Andrew Jackson, it goes in your body. You could take a knife and dig it out. One of these bullets, because they have a hollow interior, basically when they hit you or hit anything, they shatter and create shrapnel pieces of metal. And basically they tear men apart. And this is what assault weapons do today as well. There's some wonderful videos online of bullets going into tissue like a side of beef with assault weapons, and the shrapnel is everywhere. So what happens in the Civil War now, if you're hit by these things, you're pretty much going to die. They can't repair the damage. If you're hit in an arm or a leg, amputate, as we said, very quickly within 36 hours because blood poisoning is going to set in. That was your only chance. If you are hit in the torso, in the body, they knew that's a death sentence. 9 times out of 10, 90% death rate due to infection. They can't repair the damage of these new bullets. You can't just dig it out. It shreds everything basically in the body. And again, the infection rate, because there's no antibiotics, 90%. And they know it. They know what the death rate is. These bullets spin in the air and have a much longer trajectory. Bayonets were issued, bayonets not used too much. They were used in certain battles, but not used so much because the bullets go much further. Bayonets were a huge advantage for the British in the Revolution. They're not much an advantage in the Civil War because you can shoot the guy before he gets at you, unless he's run out of bullets. So they still have them. Okay? The strategy of the war is basically traditional European warfare. Line up and try and annihilate the other guy. The problem, of course, is east of the Mississippi, you have dense forest, and it doesn't always work. Okay, the last innovation there, slide 48, is a good example of a new technology, photography, which again is a French invention in the late 1840s. By 1860, photography was fairly widespread, but still expensive. So you do have those pictures of soldiers north and south getting a photograph before they get into war, when they're just being recruited, when they're finished with training, because this may be the only photograph they take during their lives. You can't photograph battles. The cameras were the size of a small desk. The film were glass plates painted with silver nitrate on one side. So you have guys who are photographers running around battlefields with a wagon full of glass. Not a good idea. In addition, you couldn't take action shots, which is why nobody is ever smiling in those old portraits. Try and smile for 2 minutes and hold your smile. It's really hard to do. Also, war isn't a humorous adventure. But the exposure was at least 60 seconds. So you can't take pictures of battles. What they could take is the next day, and the famous Civil War photographer Matthew Brady, Union and Confederate, would go out and take pictures of the carcasses the morning after a battle had finished. They had collections of these. Matthew Brady took, well over 1,000 war photographs of different battle scenes. And they had exhibitions, again, primarily in the North, New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and the public would come and see these photographs. This is the first time a war has ever been photographed. And the result, of course, is the public was totally appalled at the slaughter going on. Carcasses piled from one end to the other. The result, because most of these exhibitions were in the North, was a stronger anti-war movement. This war is not worth it. Let the Confederacy go. I don't care. It's not worth the blood and treasure. Okay, so all of those are new technologies that come in with the war. I am moving to slide number 53, which is the beginning, the actual combat beginning. And you can see what happens in slide 55 and 56 with the maps. For the first year and a half of the war, most of the battles are in Northwest Virginia. And that part of the South is pretty much torn to shreds. That's why you can go to Civil War battles and you can visit 3 of them in a day. In fact, some of them, like Manassas, there were 2 battles on the same field 2 or 3 years apart. So that part of Virginia really, really suffered. The goal is, again, the 2 capitals are Washington, D.C. and Richmond. So the goal of both sides is to capture the enemy's capital, and that's why most of those battles were in that area. The first big battle of the war is Manassas or Bull Run. The Union would call it after the town in the area. The Confederacy usually called it after the creek or river in the area. And this is July of 61. Remember, Lincoln has called up troops in April of 61. This basically is first blood. The importance of it is, number one, it's a Union defeat. It's a Confederate victory. And it shows that numbers are not the only thing that's going to count. This is a much larger Northern Army. The South is defending Richmond and the approaches to Richmond. The other importance of this battle is it shows this is going to be a long, bloody slog, and this is not as they called it, a fairy tale war. When news got out that there was a battle brewing, a lot of civilians in Washington, D.C., it's only like 12 miles outside of Washington, D.C., came out. They brought their children, they brought their wagons, they brought their picnic lunch, they set up on the hills and were looking for entertainment, basically. Remember, we haven't had warfare on our land since the War of 1812, and that was not that many battles. So it's been a long time since the Revolution. Families and everybody else in Washington came out to observe, to watch the battle. When the shooting starts, how nuts is this? When the shooting starts, they realize this is not a great place to be. They pack up the kids and the lunch and the wagon, and they run back to D.C. The Union troops were largely green troops with very little training, fierce, bloody fighting, and the South pushes them back. They begin to retreat towards Washington, D.C. The retreat becomes a rout, and pretty much they end up running back to D.C. at the end. The casualties were only 600 dead, which is small compared to later, but it shows that this is not going to be an easy war. The slide 54 is a photograph of our first Union commander, George McClellan. If you recognize the position he's in there, it's the same standard position that Napoleon Bonaparte used to use. He always stuck his hand inside his jacket like that. George McClellan was called Little Napoleon. He was only 34, top of his class at West Point. When Lee declines to lead the Union Army, Lincoln chooses the next best candidate, who is George McClellan. His job is to train the Union Army. He did. He did a wonderful job. He did it beautifully. And as Lincoln said, he trained it so well, he didn't want to mess it up by fighting with it. 8 months after Bull Run, he has not engaged. Lincoln also said of McClellan, he has the slows. He also had a little bit of an ego problem. He was a little, let's say, egocentric, exactly like Napoleon, actually. The North had a huge army, 140,000 men in northern Virginia. The Confederate Army was a grand total of less than 20,000. So the Union outnumbers them something like 7-1. And McClellan is convinced for some reason that he is outnumbered, that the Union doesn't have as many troops as the Confederates 20 miles away. He keeps asking for reinforcements. Lincoln says, I'm happy to give you reinforcements. Go out and fight. It has been 8-9 months and nothing has happened after our first defeat. And of course, northern civilians in northern states are getting really discouraged by this. McClellan does a few minor engagements but does not attack. Lincoln goes out to McClellan's camp to talk to him, to encourage him to engage. McClellan basically tells him, butt out. Stay out of my business. You run the government. I'll run the army. Abraham Lincoln very diplomatically says absolutely nothing, but starts looking for a new commander. And he says, if McClellan will not use the Union Army, I would like to borrow it. I will take it and fight. Lincoln went through 5 additional Union commanders before he found General Grant. McClellan was very good. He doesn't fight, but he excels in making, and I'm quoting, others ready to fight. The flip side of that, I'm doing a couple Northern, a couple Confederate. The key figures in the map was slides 57, 59 to 59 is Stonewall Jackson, who had no problem engaging and no problem fighting at any point. Stonewall Jackson is one of the great heroes of the Confederacy and a brilliant military commander, whether he was North or South. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant strategist. He is fighting in northern Virginia, northwestern Virginia, 3 Union armies, all of which are twice the size of his troops. And for over a year, they can't catch him. Anytime he engages, he almost always wins the battle. He would march his troops. Think of a fox here. Pretty much wherever the Union expected him to be, he was someplace else. So the Union was planning for a battle the next morning. They would get in the evening, and Stonewall Jackson would march his troops 30, 35 miles overnight around the back of the Union troops and attack from the rear or from the sides. Every single time he would flank them, go around the flanks, go around the side. The Southern Army technically had 1,400 troops on paper, but only 2,000 were veterans, experienced, and total, maybe at any time he had 5,000 in his group, but almost every battle he won. Jackson, poor boy, poor family, went to West Point, top of the class, and interesting fact about him, he was a devout religious fundamentalist. He would not fight on a Sunday, which drove Robert E. Lee absolutely crazy. What do you mean you're not going to fight on a Sunday? He had all kinds of strange ideas. He would suck on lemons during battles. He would ride into battle with his left arm raised because he thought it was improving your blood flow. I mean, very eccentric guy, but devoutly religious. He believed, and he was right, that he was under God's protection. God would protect him, that he was fighting God's cause in the Confederacy to preserve slavery. He's absolutely right. He was a young officer in the Mexican War, and this is an actual true story because there were witnesses to this. During the Mexican War, he was commanding an artillery battalion, and the Mexican artillery was shooting at them, and a cannonball, no kidding, went between his legs without touching him. So he literally believed from that point on that God was protecting him. He would be touched. He got his name because at Manassas Bull Run, he came up at the end of the battle when the Union troops looked like they were going to win and the Confederates were beginning to start retreating. Stonewall Jackson came up and said, "What's going on here?" And they said, the Union Army is pushing us back. And he said, "Well, we will have to put them to the sword then." Got his troops, charged the Union troops, and pushed them back. His men absolutely adored him. They would follow him through flaming hoops. Never touched by enemy fire. Would ride into the middle of battle, stand still, and at Manassas, this is exactly what happened. One Confederate soldier looked over and said, yonder stands Jackson, solid as a stone wall, and he became Stonewall Jackson and was famous for it. Worked hand in glove with Lee. The two of them didn't even have to communicate. Jackson knew exactly what Lee would be planning and help him out with it. So how did he die? After outfoxing the 3 Union armies in Virginia for a year and a half, he's out on a reconnaissance patrol at evening, and he comes back in, and he is shot by his own men. They didn't recognize it. They thought it was an enemy patrol coming in. They didn't hear him call back, and he is shot. He gets several bullets, one in the shoulder, one in the leg. Of course, he's a very famous general, so he has excellent medical care. They operate. They had to amputate his left arm. When Lee was informed of this, Lee very famously said, "Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. This is my right-hand man. This is my number one commander." He dies 3 days later of blood poisoning. So he didn't die of the wounds again, but he died of blood poisoning. Great military strategist. Never were they expected him, always coming around the back because he doesn't have enough men for a head-on attack. In 48 days, at one point in Virginia, he marched his men close to 700 miles in 48 days with 5 major battles. In other words, almost no downtime. This was unheard of at the time. His men adored him. They would follow him anywhere. So McClellan, Jackson, absolutely opposite tactics, absolutely opposite personalities. We will go on and talk about the war in the West and the Emancipation Proclamation next time. Stay safe and well.